I I feel that we could deal with some of these questions, and then as we go on, I'm sure a lot of subjects will open up that we can talk about. Yesterday and day before, as some of you may know, we dealt with a comprehensive sort of survey of the life of a Baha'i. And the theme was, what should we do? How can we live to enable our faith to grow? And I think we still can talk about that, naturally. You can talk around it and about this. But I think this morning I will pick up this question here. Is the person who has written this here? You have. It says, please tell the story. Oh, story about circumambulation. I thought you meant the wisdom of it, or this, or the yes. Well, first of all, I think I will mention this circumambulating. As you know, in the faith, this is a way of showing one's love and devotion to one that you worship as your God, as your Lord. You circumambulate around him. And this is actually a law, this is a principle of nature. Again, in nature, you can find a parallel for this. You will find always an object which depends upon its creator. It revolves around it. You know, for instance, the earth revolves around the sun. It's in love with it. This is a love relationship. And the satellite revolves around the earth. It is the force of love, really, as we know. I mean, from the point of view of physics, we know what holds the satellite in motion. It is that force of attraction, which is the love, and the speed of its action that make it circumambulate its beloved. And so it is a law of nature that if you depend on someone as your creator, you circumambulate around it. And this is why when you go to the shrines, the act of circumambulating the shrine is an act of devotion to your Lord. In the writings, we come across this statement many a times, that the lovers circumambulate around their beloved. Now, the story of circumambulation, which is a story I mentioned to our friend in here, and he has recorded it in his tape. I think, I am always reluctant to talk about these accounts unless it is in writing. I feel we must be very accurate in quoting these things, because when the disciples of Baha'u'lláh have recorded such incidents or such accounts, they have recorded it to the best of their ability and knowledge, and all we can do is to translate it and convey it. To try to put our own words to it, it sort of snowballs a little bit. I mentioned yesterday that we must not try to verbally communicate these stories. And this particular story that you have asked me to say, and I don't know how you come to know about it, probably Red must have told you this. He's hiding away there. And this is already recorded in the videotape. Well, I will tell you the story. But don't go and tell everybody about this. Really, just keep it for yourself. Because I say this to you. First of all, such stories which relate to us the greatness of the cause, and such stories which relate to us things like miracles, things which sounds and looks like miracles. These things we are not supposed to consider them as miracles, because Baha'u'llah says, do not attribute any miracles to him. He says this will degrade the station of the manifestation of God. These accounts are only good for people who have seen them. And often people who had seen some of these accounts, I remember when I was a young boy, and they wouldn't tell us. They were very reluctant to talk about it because they didn't want to make it a point by which people would say, oh yes, this is the proof of the truth of this faith. You know, we never bring miracles as the proof of the truth of this faith. And as I said, Baha'u'llah says no one should attribute miracles to him. Although Abdul Baha has said that you can talk about it because it will give people joy and excitement, and it will uplift the souls to think about it. But we are not attributing miracles here. As I said, Baha'u'llah says it will degrade the station of the manifestation of God. Now, they were reluctant. Those people who were the origin of all these stories, they were reluctant to say it because, and especially when there were people who were not Baha'is, they would never say it to them. They would wait till people really become deep in the faith who could sort of take it and put it in the right perspective. Now, I will tell you the story of Baha'u'llah. You know that when Baha'u'llah was in the house of Abud, that's the time that he, as you know, he spent about 7 years in those two houses, which is now called the house of Abud. And he had never seen a blade of grass, really, something green, trees, which he was so fond of. He really kept, as I said yesterday, the manifestation of God submits himself entirely to what his enemies do to him. He never uses his powers to stop them persecuting him. And so Baha'u'llah submitted to his enemies, and he did not leave that house. Although several governors who had come, they were so friendly. Some of them became so much the admirers of Abdul Baha, and in one or two cases they even met Baha'u'llah in the house of Abud, that they became so much carried away with his powers, and they saw his glory, that they openly said that, of course, Baha'u'llah could leave the town if he wanted it. And Abdul Baha could leave the town if he wanted it. But you see, they were incarcerated in that city according to the edict of the Sultan. Now, Baha'u'llah had mentioned to Abdul Baha on one occasion that it is 9 years, he said, that he had not seen any sceneries of green and trees and flowers. And Abdul Baha immediately realized that his will now is that he should leave this place. And as you all may have heard, I'm sure, he went out and he rented these gardens outside Baghdad, outside Akka, known as the mansion of Mazra'e nowadays. The mansion of Mazra'e, as you see it now, those of you who have seen it, has been developed further since those days of Baha'u'llah. In those days were much smaller and much more primitive than what it is today, but certain basic part of the house is still there. The room of Baha'u'llah is still there, and all those things. Things have been added to it. Things have not really, there's not much change in it, except things have been added to it. Rooms have been added. So Abdul Baha rented this for a very reasonable price. And then he arranged the making of a special carriage. In those days, there were no such thing as carriages around. And then he came to Baha'u'llah and he said, the carriage is ready, the gardens, the house outside is ready, and that he said, please, you can come out and let's go. Baha'u'llah said to him, no. He said no. He was a prisoner and he was staying there. Now here is a point that you must remember. I mentioned yesterday, the relationship that Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha had was not the same relationship as an ordinary son and the father. You know how it is, how informal is the relationship of the son and the father. That Abdul Baha could sort of insist and persist and say, oh, please come on, let's go, and this sort of thing. It wasn't like this. Baha'u'llah was his Lord. He had recognized him so much that none of us can ever recognize Baha'u'llah to that extent. And he showed such humility and such submissiveness to Baha'u'llah that no person can ever do. Now here is a point that you must remember. I mentioned yesterday, the relationship that Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha had was not the same relationship as an ordinary son and the father. You know how it is, how informal is the relationship of the son and the father. That Abdul Baha could sort of insist and persist and say, oh, please come on, let's go, and this sort of thing. It wasn't like this. Baha'u'llah was his Lord. He had recognized him so much that none of us can ever recognize Baha'u'llah to that extent. And he showed such humility and such submissiveness to Baha'u'llah that no person can ever do. And in fact, it was Abdul Baha who taught the believers. You know, whenever believers came to the Holy Land, to attain the presence of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha would prepare them for coming in contact with Baha'u'llah. He would even look at their clothes and see whether their clothes were good enough. And if it wasn't, which in many cases were not, he would give them a new coat, new clothes to wear, so that when they go into the presence of Baha'u'llah, they are very well, you know, they look their best. And so, you know, and he taught them the lessons in humility and self-effacement and reverence. He taught them, prepared them for this. Well, so you can imagine when Baha'u'llah said no, he will not go, that he was a prisoner in that house. Abdul Baha could not insist. He could not say any more. But then he decided he better get somebody who is not a believer. He could insist. And so he went along and he saw the Mufti of Akka, which is a religious head of the city. And he was one of those great admirers of Baha'u'llah, this Mufti. A man by the name of Miri, he was Ali Miri. He was a very devoted person. He was really devoted to Baha'u'llah. Wasn't only an admirer, but he really became a worshipper, you can say, of Baha'u'llah. He had seen so many miracles, really, that man in his life during that short period that Baha'u'llah was in Akka. That he once came to Abdul Baha and he said to Abdul Baha, he said, every time I stand to pray, Baha'u'llah appears in front of me. I pray to him. You see, this is how the influence of the power of God can change the hearts of people. And at first he was a great, I wouldn't say enemy, but he was a very difficult person. He was very much against the faith and the founder of the faith. And he met Baha'u'llah in the barracks of Akka, this man. And he was so proud that Abdul Baha kept on reminding him when he went to the presence of Baha'u'llah that he must change his attitude. And if ever he wanted to say anything, if this man wanted to say anything in the presence of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha would say, be quiet, don't say anything. You know, this is how he really enabled him to see gradually the greatness and the power of the faith. And then came a time that this Mufti of Akka became such an admirer of Abdul Baha that if he ever walked with him, he always walked behind. the master, which is a very important sign in the East. If you walk with somebody, it depends who you are and who he is. If he is more important than you, you never walk in front of him. You always stay a step behind. And he always walked behind the master. And anyhow, this man came to Baha'u'llah, and he said that, why aren't you going to this house outside Akka? And Baha'u'llah said to him that he was a prisoner. He would not go. And he said, he insisted. And he said, everything is ready. You are not a prisoner. No one can keep you a prisoner. And remember, the edict of the Sultan was still in force. The edict of the Sultan was still in force. But, and he said he will not leave Baha'u'llah. He just kept on. He clung to the hem of Baha'u'llah's garment, and he knelt before him. And he said, not until he accepts this leaving the house will he leave him. And so Baha'u'llah said, okay. And then, as you know, he went to the mansion of Mazra'e for the first time. And he went in that carriage. And Abdul Baha says, I took him there and I returned back to Akka myself. And so Baha'u'llah then spent mostly the months of summer and the months of when the weather was not very cold, in the springtime, sometime in the autumn, he spent in that house. But he often came back to Akka. You mustn't think that when he went into that house that he never came back. Oh no, he came back many a time to Akka. And after all, Abdul Baha was living in the house of Abu. The mother of Abdul Baha was living there. The greatest holy leaf was living there at the time. And so he often came to the house of Abu. And then, as you know, this mansion of Bahji came into the picture. The mansion of Bahji was completed by the same man who owned the house, part of the house of Abu, a man called Udi Khammar. He completely finished. It was half-built building. Udi Khammar, he finished it up, and he made it a residence for himself. He wanted to move into this great palace in the outside, of Akka. But as you know the details, how the outbreak of cholera took place and how Abdul Baha went along and rented that from him. And Baha'u'llah then moved into that. Now, when he moved, he really did not move from the mansion of Mazra'e into the mansion of Bahji. It happened that he was in Akka. When he left for the mansion of Bahji, he left Akka from the house of Abu to the mansion of Bahji. And it was just at the time that my father was in the presence of Baha'u'llah at that time as a pilgrim. And he said that when this building was rented by Abdul Baha, the believers went there along with Abdul Baha, and they washed the building with soap and water and everything else, because it is a marble building in the top part of it, and they washed it all and cleaned it for the coming that Baha'u'llah will come into it. And the first people who moved in were the family of Baha'u'llah, but not the mother of Abdul Baha or the greatest holy leaf or Abdul Baha himself. They did not move. And the reasons for it, now we don't go into it. Then, one day, it was known that Baha'u'llah is going to move to that mansion. And as you know, Akka in those days did not have any public lighting. The whole area was in the dark at night, absolutely dark. But some Baha'is of India had sent to Baha'u'llah a very unusually large lamp, oil lamp, oil, the wick, the oil. And this lamp was brought into the mansion, and it was put in the hall, and you could see it from distance, a light shining in the mansion. So now this is the background to it. So one day, Baha'u'llah was to go and move to this mansion. And my father and Nabil, both of them, were living in a little room in one of the streets of Akka. The street of Akka, called the Souq Abyaz, means the white market. And when you live in that place, they had a window which was overlooking the road. And the only way that someone can come from the house of Abu to go to go through the gate and go out of Akka is to pass in front of that house. And so they were standing behind the window, waiting just for a time that Baha'u'llah would be passing in front of their house, in front of their room. And they waited and waited until near sunset, before sunset. And then suddenly they saw that Baha'u'llah was then riding a donkey. It was very custom. This was the only way in those days. It was not the carriage, just a donkey. And behind was Baha'u'llah's servant, about 10 yards behind him. He was riding on his donkey. And the two passed in front of this room. And as soon as it passed and they saw him, Nabil said, "Let us go and follow them." So the two of them came out and they walked behind about 200 yards away, following Baha'u'llah. And when they reached the gates of the city, the guards showed their respects to Baha'u'llah, and he went out, and these two also went out afterwards. And soon it became dark, evidently. And then they could see, eventually they reached the point that they could see the light in the mansion. All the sufferings and hardships and tortures, And then all the exiles, years of exile in Baghdad, the mountains of Sulaymaniyah, wandering around. And then being sent into Adrianople in the remote, as he calls it, the remote prison. And then coming into the most great prison in Akka. Then staying in all these houses and not coming out. Now this house, this mansion, was really the climax, you might say, of the ministry of Baha'u'llah during the years that he lived in that mansion. Almost half of his ministry in Akka was spent in this building. It's really the climax of his revelation when God really ascended upon his throne. This is the throne in some of his writings referred to, is the throne there is this building, the throne of God. And in the traditions, it's very clear that when God sits on his throne, all the messengers and the concourse on high circumambulated. You can see in the writings too. Well, these two people wanted to circumambulate now this throne of their Lord. And when they went close to near the mansion, near the walls of the mansion, they found that 4 sides of the mansion is packed with people. Now they were not imagining things. They were not psychic people. They were very clear-headed. And they, of course, knew there's nobody from Akka. There's not one soul has left Akka at the time. There's nobody. There was none of these people. 4 sides. And they were filled with such awe You can imagine the awe of that particular occasion must have been tremendous. That they couldn't go close. And they realized that to them, this is really what their outer eyes could see was nothing but the souls of the manifestations of God and the concourse on high, circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And so they went back, and then they circumambulated from long distance away in great awe and wonder, of having seen this. And he says that our shoes were filled with mud, and the whole area was wet, and all the mud that they went through. And then they quickly left for Ak. And they arrived just in time that they were closing the doors, the gates of the city. But they managed to get in. Now there is a custom amongst the people of the East that when something very, very important happens, they won't sleep that night. For instance, when you look at the passing of Baha'u'llah, when Baha'u'llah passed away, the friends don't sleep that night. They stay up in his memory and they say prayers. The same thing happens to the time of Abdul Baha passing. Now, Nabil said to my father, he said, tonight we must not sleep. We must stay awake. And Nabil was a man who used to drink a lot of tea. He said to my father, he said, you make tea and I will write poems about this whole episode. And so that night, Nabil wrote the whole story of this in poetry. Many of Nabil's notes, Nabil, the historian of the faith, many of his notes are in poetry. You must not think that the first section of the Dawn Breakers, which Shoghi Effendi has edited for us, is exactly what Nabil has written it in this form. This is edited by Shoghi Effendi. Some of these notes are in different forms. He had put them together and produced it. And the rest of his memoirs and notes, which deal with the history of Baha'u'llah, which are not published yet, they are also, some of them, in this form. So that night he wrote this, the whole story of what had happened. And in the morning, the two of them sent to Baha'u'llah this poem of Nabil. And they also sent him, in those days it was customary for the believers to send gifts to Baha'u'llah. Just like you give a box of chocolates now. In those days, the very popular thing was a sugar cone. You may not have seen what a sugar cone is like. In those days, sugar were made in the form of a cone, big cones, and then you break them for your tea and other uses. So they sent 2 of these as a gift to Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah wrote a tablet. We don't have this tablet because maybe this was with Nabil's things. We haven't found it yet. And in this tablet, Baha'u'llah accepts their pilgrimage at a time that all the concourse on high were circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And he gives a new name to each one of them. Now, as I said, don't go along and tell the stories because it's bound to become it'll change in his career. I've heard people saying this because Shoghi Effendi used to tell the story to some of the pilgrims. And the pilgrims would come and say this story to an audience like this. And then I have heard myself that some other people have been saying the story. And when you say, how did you hear it? He heard it 2 or 3 steps away, which meant that it was so changed that it had a bare resemblance to what I was telling you now. So here we are. You asked me to tell you the story. Now I feel that we better deal with some of these questions which are in here. Or what would you like me to do? Anybody has a question now? Yes?
Would you please speak to us a little bit about the fear of God?
Oh, fear of God. Gosh, you're all going to be frightened, huh? No. I think it's a good point. Actually, somebody has asked this question. You know, Baha'u'lláh has mentioned in many of his writings that the fear of God is what we have to, all of us, feel. And that he says, not until you have that fear of God in your hearts will you be able to progress. Now, you can read in the gleanings. I don't have it in here. In fact, if you had the gleanings here, we could find it for you and read it, those passages. But anyhow, we can read it later on, maybe. You can read it later on at some stage. He says this is the way in which man can progress spiritually. Now, we must remember here that fear of God, God is loving, God is just, God is full of bounties. Now, why can we fear him? How should we fear him? You know, first of all, let me mention this, because I said God has bounties and has justice. Do you know that it is through the bounty of God that we have come into being, not through his justice? It's a very important point to remember. It's not through the justice of God that man is created. And it is not also through the justice of God that divine revelations are sent. It's through the bounty of God. Now, Baha'u'lláh has mentioned that if ever the justice of God comes into being, the whole creation will cease to exist. You see now? I'll explain to you. You know, if you have got some money in your pocket, and if you go to a shop, it is only just that the shopkeeper should give you something equal to your money. It's justice. You give him the money, he gives you the goods. This is justice. But what would you do if you went to a shop and you had no money at all, and the man gave you a lot of things? This is not justice. This is bounty. Now, Baha'u'lláh says, look at yourself and see what you are. He says, you are a handful of dust. You're made from the dust. And the dust is the most worthless things you can find in this creation. It's the lowest kingdom. You're made of dust. And he says, look at, you had nothing. And he says, look what I gave you. I gave you the most precious entity in creation, and that is the soul. But you had nothing. So you see, creation comes into being purely through the bounty of God. If it was through its justice, we did not deserve anything because we were dust. You see? This is a very significant point that he mentions. So the bounties of God is the cause of progress and development spiritually. If ever justice comes into being, as he says, the creation will not exist, cannot exist. Disintegrates immediately, finishes. Now God, therefore, through his creation, he has brought about his bounties for us. And I mentioned yesterday how the forgiveness of God, that how much the forgiveness of God plays a role in life, not in this life, but also in the next life. That is to say that through his forgiveness, all people will progress. Every person will progress in the spiritual worlds of God. We do not believe in eternal damnation. Every soul will grow. Even those who have had a terrible life here, who knows how God will deal with them? We don't know. We cannot here judge and say, oh no, this man is going to be treated this way or that way. Who knows? Baha'u'lláh mentions one of his greatest enemies, who was the ambassador, Turkish ambassador, the Persian ambassador in Turkey, who was a great enemy of Baha'u'llah, who did so much to hurt him, Baha'u'llah says God may forgive him because one of his relatives is a believer. You see? Who knows how God acts? So that there is no limit to God's love and mercy and forgiveness. But now let us examine fear of God. Fear comes to us when we are not able to cope with the situation. Now, isn't that right? Now, I'll give you an example of this. Say you are working in your office, or you're a student in a school. If you're a student, if you have not done your work in school, when the day of examination comes, you will be filled with fear. Not that the teacher frightens you, but that you are fearful because of your inadequacy, that you haven't done what you are supposed to do. If your boss, if your superior, or whoever you work for asks you to do something, and you don't do it, you are filled with fear. This is how fear comes to us. It's because we are inadequate. We haven't done our job. Now let us put ourselves in position of coming face to face in the next life with God or whatever it is. I'm sure we won't see the essence of God, but shall we say with the manifestation of God, with Baha'u'llah, face to face with him. Now I can have two conditions. Either I'm satisfied that everything he has asked me to do, I have done it absolute perfection, so I have no fear. Right? Now, that's the answer to it. Or, if I haven't done anything at all, I would be very fearful. There is another alternative if I'm not fearful. Maybe I'm not fearful because I don't think these things will happen in the next life. Maybe Baha'u'llah will never come face to face to me. Maybe he never asked me, why did he do this or that? But this is not true. We know that we will have to give account of everything. You see, Baha'u'llah mentions that. He says, keep your account every day before you are asked to give your account before God. So fear comes not because God is a fearful figure, that you're frightened of him. But fear comes to us because we are inadequate. We look at our shortcomings. And then when you are going to really face him, when you really realize, now this is the time, now I'm going to face him, the fear of God is engendered in one's heart. This is really what it is, the fear of God. It's because we are conscious of our shortcomings. And then when you realize that what you had to do. Now I tell you, I had once an experience, and I'll share it with you. It's a personal experience, but I share it with you. You know how it is every time we have a problem in life, personal problem or any problem, we immediately go to God and pray to him. As soon as you have a problem, you just take the prayer book and you sit down and you pray, the remover of difficulties and all the others that we are familiar with. Well, one day I was doing the same thing. And suddenly, now I can tell you there, really and truly, suddenly I saw Baha'u'llah, as if I saw him in front of my eyes saying to me something. And you know what he said to me? Quite frankly, I got it very clear. He said, shame on you. This is what he said. Shame on you. Every time you have a problem, you come to me. Really? But did you ever come once to me and say, oh, please help me to teach your faith, help me to serve your faith. I am longing to do something for you. No, you only come to me when you have a problem. Shame. Now, I really stopped praying. I just stopped it. Couldn't say anything. And it came to me like a thunderbolt. Now, you know, it's like this. And it became very clear. that it was like this, that you have a very good friend. Say you have a very, very good friend, one of your best friends, a very influential friend, a very best friend that you have, that you give your life for him. And he lives, say, in another country. And he writes to you and he says, look, I want you to do something for me in here. I can't be in your country, but I want you to go to this shop and buy this and that for me. What would you do as soon as he writes to you? You immediately go and get it for him. He says, you are the only one who can do it. Go and get it for me. But what happens if I don't do it? I won't do it today, I won't do it tomorrow, I won't do it the next month, and the next month, and the next month, and the next year. I will never go to get this thing that my friend wants me to get for him. But then every time I need something, I'll go to him. And I expect him immediately to answer it. Now you see, this is exactly the situation. So that really when we think and we find that we have so much to do, and this life is so short. So much to do for Baha'u'llah. He has asked us to teach his faith. Now that's what I said, shame on me. That was the answer. I don't do it. And instead I go to him for all my problems. And then, when the real time comes, really, if Baha'u'llah would come and say to you, what have you done now in your life? Let us examine it. What have you got? What is the result of your whole life? What have you done? Well, this is where the fear comes. Because one is not adequate. But you know, there is one thing we must remember. Again, remember the forgiveness of God. Once you fear him, yes, then naturally one fear him. One fear that one hasn't done what he is supposed to do. But also remember the bounties, the love of your Lord. You know, our life is like this glass. You see, this glass of water here. Every service that we render is like a drop of water that you put in this. And at the end of a lifetime, all that you have is the result of your life. Here, you present it. This is what you have. That's what you take with us. That's what we take with us into the next life. We talked about it the first day. Remember, we said we can only take good things into the next life. And all our deeds is like this perfect water that we are taking with us. Drop by drop. We serve today, we serve tomorrow, and this adds together, accumulates together. But a little bit of impurities, then it will make the whole glass to become adulterated. A little bit of self, a little bit of ambition. These are the things will really destroy our services to the faith. There may be a man who has served an awful lot in this life. There have been some people like this, served enormously, very on a great high scale. But at the end, they did something which destroyed it altogether. And so the cup of water, instead of being pure, it is adulterated. But there is one remedy which we can still have, and this is again a marvelous thing that we have this remedy. You know, have you seen in chemistry, there are some, if you have something, for instance, colorful, dirty, you just drop one little chemical into it, it'll purifies it, cleanse it immediately. And this is the same thing here in our deeds, in our life. We can cleanse our deeds and our actions with servitude, becoming a servant really, becoming selfless. That is like this chemical which will purify all the wrong things that one has done. And God will come to you then in great measures. This is why Baha'u'llah says, how many a person who has lived a life of service, and at the end, just at the end, when he is going to go, he does something which will ruin his whole life. All his services are gone. And how many a person who has lived a terrible life, and just at the time of his passing, through one deed, through the carrying out of one action, just like this chemical that I say you drop into this water, he will become completely absolved of all the wrong things he had done. And that's why he says, no one knows what his end shall be, and that we should pray for ourselves, that we may end up in with pure deeds and pure thoughts and pure actions. The most important thing is not to serve the faith. The most important thing is to serve the faith with pure motive. You know, if I serve the faith with wrong motive, and there may be some people, I don't know, when one looks upon oneself, one comes across this, that one may be serving for sometimes, or to some extent for wrong motives. If you serve the faith because, oh, well, I serve the faith so that I become responsible for this work or that work, and people will pay attention to me, or I'll become an important person, well, this is really dangerous. This is dangerous. I mentioned there's nothing in this life except a station of servitude for us. And servitude is what Abdul Baha says, become like a dust in the pathway of thy loved ones. I remember when I was young, and I was going, my father was in prison at the time, and I remember that we used to go once a year to a very, very remote village, hidden behind so many mountains, lofty, very high mountains, higher than these mountains here, or almost like these mountains. We had to go maybe 3 days riding on a donkey to get to this little village. And in that village, the whole village was Baha'i. But it was very small, maybe about 20 people in it. It was the same village that in 1955, when there was a wave of persecution against the Baha'is of Iran, it's called Hormozak, 7 people were martyred. Well, we used to go once a year, or at least my father used to go, and when I was a young man, I used to go with him, just to meet with these believers who were so cut off. And most of these believers were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. They were very beautiful people, very humble, very beautiful, full of the love of Baha'u'llah. But they had no education. And that year, my father was in prison because of the faith. And he sent me a message. He said, now you go on your own. Now at that time, I was just a student in the university. I'd just come the first year of university. And oh, you know how it is when you go into the university, you become very important. You feel very important and all the rest of it as young persons. And he said, now there is one condition. When you go there, you must never feel yourself superior to these people because you can read and write. You must never sit with them in a disrespectful manner, just with an air of superiority. He gave me a lot of information about that. That we must consider ourselves as dust in the pathway of these loved ones of God. He said, if you can go like this, then go on. And I can tell you, it's a marvelous experience for us to become humble before each other. Because I mentioned yesterday, each one carries with him a sign of Baha'u'llah. And it is when you look into that face, you must see a sign of Baha'u'llah. Because all I can say in my life is that I am related to Baha'u'llah by name. I can't say more than that. I can't say really I am a Baha'i. This is where the fear comes in also. How can I say I'm a Baha'i, really and truly? But I am related by name to him. And that's enough. That's enough to look into the faces of the believers. And then you love them because of Baha'u'llah. And the friends, when they have this devotion to the faith, and they serve the faith just because, with the right motive, then the great powers will come upon us. But if we serve the faith with the wrong motive, well, I don't know. It's not really what will be. It's not acceptable, really. Baha'u'llah mentions that two things are very dear to God. One is the blood of the martyr. Now, the blood of the martyr. Now, why is it that the blood of the martyr is dear to God? It's because you know that the purpose of life in here is that we may become detached from this world and draw nearer to God. This is the purpose of life. But God has given us barriers. There are barriers. There are several barriers that we have to overcome. The barrier between man and God is his attachment. Baha'u'llah says there are three types of attachment. One of them is attachment to this world. We talked about it yesterday a little bit. Attachment to the things of this world. This is one barrier. If we can remove that barrier, then we have two other barriers to overcome. The other barrier, he says, is attachment to the next life and the reward of the next life. That's a very, very deep subject when you think of it. We don't serve Baha'u'llah. The motive should not be, let me serve Baha'u'llah so that in the next life I have a good position there, you know. We serve God not because we are going to be rewarded. But do you know why we serve God? Baha'u'llah mentions it in our daily prayers. You read it every day. The noon prayer. I don't know it in English. In Arabic. When you translate it, it will become, I bear witness, O God, that thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. That is the purpose of creation. God has not created us for anything else, but just that we know him and to worship him. Do you remember when we were talking about the soul, I was mentioning that the purpose of life is for us, for our soul to bring forth a fruit, a child, and that the only way it can do it is to turn to another force, to another agency, and that the purpose of life is that we turn to Baha'u'llah, that we love him and worship him, and as a result of this, the spirit of faith is born in us. So you see, we do not carry out all the teachings of God so that in the next life we can become a very exalted person, great station. Although this will happen, there's no doubt about it. This will come by itself. But to be attached to it, it's a wrong reason for serving the faith. You see how delicate these parts are? And the other barrier which Baha'u'llah says, which John in here pointed out to us, is the kingdom of names, attachment to the kingdom of names, which is really, it boils down being attachment to our own perfections and accomplishments. You become attached to your knowledge. You like yourself because you are a knowledgeable man. You like to be praised because you're a knowledgeable man. This is attachment to the kingdom of names. You love to be praised for other actions that you do. This is another form of barrier. Now, these barriers removed, you have a martyr. Because a martyr is a person who becomes detached 100%. When he says, I give my life, what has he done? He has become 100% detached. There is but none of us can reach to that point unless you come to that very point of testing, when you are tested at that hour, that moment. If you say so, if you come to that point and then you decide and say, I'll give my life, you become 100% detached. And that is what God loves, more than anything else, because it's 100%. It's a complete detachment. And this is why Baha'u'llah says, the blood of the martyr is the most precious thing in the sight of God, because you have given up your all in the path of God. And the other thing, which is beloved of God, the tears which are shed in fear of God. The tears which are shed in fear of God. And then Baha'u'lláh in this tablet, he says, we do not want people to give their lives. We do not want people to give their lives. The world should be such that people don't have to give their lives. And so he said, we have replaced it in this dispensation. We had replaced the blood of the martyr with teaching, with the efforts and the work of a teacher. Teaching the cause of God has the most meritorious of all things in the sight of God. It's the most meritorious. It's not one of the most meritorious, but the most meritorious. Because we talked a great deal about teaching yesterday. Remember, I was saying the purpose of teaching is not just to increase our numbers. Main purpose is not that, but it is to bring a soul to its God. And we talked about it. You remember the force of attraction and all the rest of it we spoke about. You people are in the habit of drinking, drinking coffee and things, huh? Yes. No, go on, yes. Otherwise.
The book of Certitude, I believe, I don't have my books now, so I can't remember exactly which book. But it says every man has a conscience, but not every man has a sense of shame. Is this part?
Yes, well, it is not in the Kitab-i-Iran, but it is in one of his tablets, which he quotes in the epistle to the son of the wolf. He quotes it. Yes, he says that he's talking again about the fear of God, really, and the importance of religion. That religion, you see, he says that when you have to carry out a teaching of God, not everybody has this. It's very difficult to translate that word, shame, as you put it, the word shame, from the original language. It means that there are some human beings, but Baha'u'lláh says there are not many, who have the sense of shame. If they do something wrong, they feel ashamed of it right away. They feel immediately, they know they have done something wrong, and they'll stop doing it. But he says there are not many people like that. And therefore, he says, the laws of God are given to us that we may obey them, and that we should bring in here, obedience to the laws of God, and to have the fear. It's like saying, and I'll give you an example of it in daily life. It's like saying that there are some citizens who can live without having a policeman among them. But there are very few such people who can live in peace and tranquility in a town without any policeman. But you need a policeman. That's what Baha'u'lláh is trying to tell us. He says we have to have a policeman. We have to have an agency by which men can discipline themselves. This is the purpose of that particular, is the meaning of that particular thing that you mentioned in the writings. Well, now, I am going to, maybe we can stop sometime, but I'm going to look at some of these questions, which one of the things I love to do is to not answer questions. leave it off. So you must push me to do it for you. Let us see, where are we now? I'll look at the. Really, I feel that we are in this life. We are having so much to do. Time is so short. In every community, as I was saying yesterday, every community in the world now, the time is short. And these opportunities that we have now for deepening and for teaching, because deepening on its own should really bring forth the fruit of teaching. The time will come that we will have not these opportunities. But now the challenge has just come. And if we don't do it, if we don't arise to really respond to the call of teaching, all these questions are good and we must learn it. But the most important thing in our life is to think every day, am I teaching? And again, I wanted to make it clear, teaching doesn't mean that every day you must go and definitely talk to somebody, although it's a very good thing to do. But it means every day you must be doing something about teaching. It may be you're doing something about one person. It may be doing something about two people in your lives. But that you're doing something all the time to teach the cause of God. Because the opportunities will not come again. And God may give this to someone else to do it instead of us. The conditions of the world are moving very swiftly towards an end of all this comfort and all the peace that we still have in the world. The conditions will dramatically change. And then we may find that the opportunities are lost. But really God has chosen us, and this is a marvelous thing to think that God has chosen us from among 6,000 million peoples of the world, and have told us, like Baha'u'llah, like that friend of ours in that remote country, telling us to go and do certain things for him. He says, I can't do it, you are there, you must do it for me. And this, I think, this feeling will urge us to go ahead. But we are chosen, really, by God to carry out his work. And it is a great, great privilege. I just wanted to tell you, it came to me a story, tell you, it's a Persian story, which will indicate how much we must thank God that we are chosen today to carry this great responsibility with us. The story is a story of a mother who had 3 children, 3 sons. Do you know that story? Mother who had 3 sons. And she wanted to know which one of them is worthy to become her, to inherit her estates and become the heir in the family. And so he wanted to test his sons. And so he invited, the sons were living in a different homes, each one of them having their own lives, and the mother was living alone. And so the mother invited one of the sons to come and stay with her for the night. And she chose a very, very cold night. Snow coming, like maybe in Alaska. Snow all over the place. And that night, she cooked a meal for her son. And she put a lot of salt in it. Very much salty, full of salt. And she drained all the water from the taps and from everything. So there was no water in the house. And so they ate their food and they went to bed. And they slept. In the middle of night, when the son was fast asleep in this little cozy room, warm, she woke her son up and she said, I am very thirsty. Would you go and get me some water, please? Oh, the son got up and he said, are you really thirsty? He went to this tap, water, to get some water, and there was no water. So he came back and he said, well, there's no water, and probably you can carry on till tomorrow morning. Okay, mother said, fine, that's okay. Then the second son did the same thing exactly to her. And the second son came, and the mother got up, and she said, look, I am very thirsty tonight. Would you give me some water? The boy got up again, and she said, are you really thirsty? She went there, and she looked at the water and found there was no water. She came back and she slept. She said, there's nothing there. But then, soon afterwards, he himself got thirsty. So he got up and he went out. He found there was no water here. He had to go in this cold weather out into the well to drag some water out of the well. So he went outside and he took some water for himself, drank some water. And he said, well, it's not a bad thing. My mother was thirsty. I bring a cup for her as well. So he brought a cup, woke up her mother and said, there is some water for you. Now, that's the second son. He brought the water, but he brought it with the wrong motive. You know what I mean? The first time that the mother was thirsty, he didn't go out. But when he himself became thirsty, he goes into all the trouble in the cold outside, gets the water, brings it along. He drinks it himself because he was thirsty, and then he gives it to his mother. You see how wrong motive is? And then, of course, the third son, what he did, you can imagine. As soon as the mother said, I'm thirsty, he went out, he found there was no water. He said, okay, I'll go outside and I'll get some water for you. And when he came back, he gave the water to his mother. Now that was chosen. That person was chosen to become the heir because he did serve him with the right motive. And this is exactly like us now. We have been chosen, really. And when we do things with the right motive, but then the time will come, I can assure you, the time will come that we will be longing to do service to the cause, to bring great numbers into the faith, and we may not be able to do it. This is what happened in Persia. The believers in Persia are now longing to do something, but they can't. They can't. The doors will be closed. Now, I'll tell you another story, and then we'll go for a little drink. You know that they say there was a man in Persia. Often farmers have to go, because there is usually throw them on the ground for their cattle to eat. And one man went up one of these very tall trees, very, very tall. And when he went very, very tall, up went to the very top of it, suddenly he slipped a little bit and he fell down. Very high up, and he knew he's going to be killed. There's no question about it, falling from that height. At that moment, in desperation, in a fraction, in all this thing coming in a split second, he turned to God and he said, if you save me, I'll give all my cattle to you. All that I have, and that's all he had. All my cattle to you, for you. I don't want them. Please save me. And of course, God heard him, and he said, okay, we will see we'll test him. See, God always tests. He, instead of falling down on the ground, he fell on another branch. And he just hardly held himself. But it was, when he looked down, it was again dangerous. But it wasn't as dangerous as before. He was further down. So he again began to pray, please save me from here, he said. But he said, last time when I was on the top of the tree, I said, I'll give all my cattle to you. I think it's not fair, he said, that I should give all my cattle to you. Really and truly, I think half of the cattle for you. And after all, I have a wife and family and children. What will you do with all the cattle anyhow? I'll keep half of it, and the other, you save me. I'll keep the half, and then you keep the other half. So God said, okay, we let him go down a little bit more. So this time he fell down, and he came down and he landed on another branch, which wasn't at all as high as the previous one. But still, he saw now if he falls down, he's not going to be killed. That's the danger of death is gone. So he said, really, God, I was becoming very sentimental and carried away. I was really carried away. I think this is altogether an unfair situation. I mean, what will you do with... I have a wife, I have children, I've lived all these years, I've gathered these cattle, and now give you half of it. Really, what will you do with the half? Really, that's unfair. I was carried away, he said, when I was up there. I'll make a deal with you, he said. I'll have all the cattle, and you have all the milk and the cream. So God said, okay, that's all right. Fair enough. And he let him drop down to the ground. And when he dropped down to the ground, he said to himself, what milk, what butter? Oh no, you don't want it. Really, this was all unusual excitement on my part. You don't need it. Now you see, I said the story that now at this time in the history of mankind, we are now on the ground. Our foot is on the ground and we are safe. But a time will come, I can assure you, that we will be on the top. And then we are ready to give everything. And then it may not be just work out for us. This is what happened in Persia. Because the world conditions will really dramatically change. We talked, the world conditions will deteriorate with such speed now that it is going to bring about what Baha'u'llah has foreshadowed. The limbs of mankind to quake. Shoghi Effendi mentions, he says, the cities will burn. The atmosphere of the earth will be contaminated. And he said, these are only either accompanying or will herald the coming of that great calamity which mankind must go through. He has written this. So that it is our really work and our privilege now to arise and serve the cause of God. And be sure of his assistance. He'll come to us if our motive is right. Well, I feel that you've had plenty of, you got tired. And we can go out, Mr. Chairman, have a cup of tea, and then we can come back again. But this time I will certainly deal with all the questions that you have left. I have them all in here.